I love Souls-like games. If you're a friend of mine, you probably already knew this, but as of recording this, I actually released a video last week where I reviewed every main boss in the game Bloodborne. I really enjoyed making that video, so today I decided that I was going to do the same exact thing but for a different Souls-like that I also love. Demon's Souls. I personally prefer the other Souls games to Demon's Souls, but I still think this game is really underrated and pretty enjoyable. Though most of my reasons don't really have anything to do with the bosses. My reviews might seem a little negative of the bosses at times, however, keep in mind that this does not reflect my overall opinion of the game. Demon's Souls also has some pretty cool bosses as well, but most of them are more gimmicky than the ones in the other Souls games, and you can definitely tell that it was the first of its kind in terms of gameplay. For the sake of your viewing pleasure, I will be playing on the remake for this video. However, the remake does not change the gameplay from how it was in the original, so my reviews of the bosses apply to both versions of the game. Unlike the other Souls games though, Demon's Souls does not have any optional bosses or areas. However, the areas and bosses can be done in practically any order. So for this video, they will just be in the order that I did them in. The first boss of the game comes right after the tutorial area, and it has a little bit of an interesting setup. When you encounter the Vanguard Demon as a boss fight, it's in a supposed to lose room that you can't access again afterward. However, you encounter it as an enemy slightly later on in the game. The Vanguard Demon doesn't really have much variety with its moveset, as it only really has two attacks. One where it jumps up and then slams back down onto the ground, and another where it swings its axe at you. However, its attacks are pretty slow and easy to avoid. The only reason it's really challenging in the tutorial is because he's able to one-shot you at your level during that point. But when you fight him as an enemy, he becomes a lot easier because you have more health. So while he still does a good bit of damage, it's not as much as it was in the tutorial. I don't really have any strong opinions on this boss, it's alright. The first gimmick boss of the game is the Phalanx. It's a boss surrounded by a bunch of enemies known as hoplites. They protect themselves with shields at their front and they'll try and throw spears at you. However, you're meant to get behind them so that way you can take them out pretty easily, as they don't have very much health. The boss itself, along with the enemies around it, are also pretty weak to fire, and since you get a lot of fire bombs beforehand, it can work wonders for clearing out the crowd to expose the boss itself. And since the enemies and boss both move very slowly, this shouldn't be too challenging to pull off. The Phalanx itself does not attack you as mentioned before, so once you've cleared out most of the enemies, the fight is pretty much over. And even when the enemies are there, it's pretty easy just to tank the damage when you're up close and personal with them, and then heal right afterwards. It's not a really good boss fight, and sadly Demon's Souls doesn't give a very good first impression, with one unremarkable boss fight and another pretty bad one being right at the start of the game. Unfortunately, things don't improve much with the armor spider. It looks really cool in my opinion, but the actual fight itself is pretty rubbish. Whenever you enter the arena, you'll be at a good distance from the armor spider, and when you're at a distance, it spams a fireball attack, which may be pretty easy to avoid, but it does definitely get annoying when you're trying to approach it because of how often it uses it. The armor spider has another ranged attack it can use where it shoots a web at you, and if it hits you, it not only slows down your movement, but stops you from rolling, meaning that you're pretty much guaranteed to get hit by any fireballs it shoots at you afterwards, unless you somehow manage to get out of the way. Once you finally manage to close the distance between yourself and the boss, its melee attacks are nothing thrilling either, as it only really uses two moves, the first of which is a vertical slice, and the second of which is a horizontal slice. But that's pretty much it, and they're pretty simple to dodge. Although the boss can throw out one attack, which is noteworthy for all the wrong reasons. It's an attack where it floods the arena with some sort of substance that then lights on fire, and you have to run all the way back to the fog gate to avoid it, and if you're just a hair too late, it's pretty much game over for you. It's not a very good fight, but at least the armor spider has a pretty sick visual design. I just wish the fight was a little better than it ended up being, though. The first genuinely great boss in Demon Souls is, in my opinion, the Tower Knight. At the beginning of the fight, there are archers above the arena which fire at you, however, the way to reach them is pretty clear, unlike the one Reborn from Bloodborne, which has a similar formula. Whether or not you decide to kill the archers though, the fight itself is actually really fun. It's mostly a pretty well done duel against a big knight with a big weapon, which we've seen a lot of in the Souls games to come. The Tower Knight doesn't just have melee attacks though, he actually has a ranged attack with his weapon where he fires a magical projectile at you, which can occasionally be a little worrying, but for the most part I've had a pretty easy time dodging it. His melee attacks are also very well telegraphed and very fair to avoid. He may not be the most challenging for me, but he's much more difficult than the other bosses before him, which I appreciate. The goal is to hack away at his ankles until he completely falls over, and after that the fight's pretty much at its end, as now you have to hit his head a bunch of times, which is pretty vulnerable. The boss executes its gimmick very well, and I really enjoy this fight. It's the first one in the game that I think is actually pretty damn good. The developers definitely did a good job with this one, and it's a sign of the strengths of Demon Souls' boss design. The Adjudicator's visual design is absolutely awesome. It's pretty unnerving, and I like it a lot, but the boss itself is nothing really all that great. All the Adjudicator will do in this fight is very, very slowly swing his cleaver at you and try to kill you. However, the attacks with it are very easy to avoid and pretty much trivial. To be fair, he does do a very big amount of damage for this point in the game if he does hit you. However, it's still very easy to just circle strafe around him to avoid the attacks. What you're meant to do is hit the weak spot sticking out of his side. So circle strafing is a pretty viable strategy here, as if you hang out on that side, it's pretty rare that you'll ever get hit by any of his attacks. After you've attacked the weak spot of the Adjudicator enough times, it will completely fall over, similar to how the Tower Knight does when you attack its ankles enough. Now all you have to do is just go to town on the bird on its head, and the fight's over. This boss isn't very good at all, but its unique presentation helps elevate it a tiny bit. Another boss that excels in its presentation and atmosphere is the Old Hero. However, it's not really a bad boss this time around. Granted, I don't really have any strong feelings towards it, but at least it's not a bad fight. This boss's gimmick is the fact that it's unable to see you and will instead try to locate you through sound. Even though it's not very difficult to counter this gimmick, I like that it makes you have to be careful, as if you're careless, you could die very easily, as this boss hits like a truck. Another noteworthy thing about this fight gameplay-wise is that this is the first instance of an AoE attack being used by a boss. But aside from that one very minor distinction, the fight plays pretty standard for Demon Souls, very slow and deliberate, and not exactly the most complicated when it comes to the moveset. This is one of only 3 bosses in the game that I have pretty much no strong opinion on. I guess the fight's okay, but I don't really have much else to note about it. The Storm King is easily the most cinematic Demon Souls boss. I just wanted to say that real quick because, man, this fight really is a spectacle, and that's one of the things that I love about it. And in terms of gameplay, it may be pretty straightforward and easy, but I still do have fun with it. When you enter the boss room, The Storm King's minions will fire projectiles at you and you won't be able to damage them back. However, in the arena, there's the only weapon that can damage them, and the one that you're meant to use for this boss fight, the Storm Ruler. After you finish clearing out the lesser enemies in the arena, you're now able to face the Storm King himself. What the fight mostly comes down to is you waiting for him to fly close to you and dodging his crystallized projectiles, and, with good timing, hitting him with the Storm Ruler until he dies. This boss isn't complex, it isn't challenging, but I still think it's very fun, and it's the only boss fight in the game where the fact that it's more focused on the visuals than the gameplay actually works in its favor instead of ruining the rest of the fight. I think this boss is actually pretty good. The boss that most people consider the hardest in Demon Souls is the Flame Lurker. I personally never really had much trouble with it, however I will say that I do enjoy the boss fight. Unlike the other bosses, the Flame Lurker moves around like some sort of beast or wild animal, and his attacks can sometimes be a little bit difficult to predict, especially whenever he delays the attacks to throw you off. Unlike most bosses as well, the Flame Lurker has no gimmick attached to it, meaning that it's a boss fight focused entirely on combat. The Flame Lurker is faster and more aggressive than most bosses too, which is something that players will have to get used to after facing the more slow and passive bosses before him. The attacks from the Flame Lurker also chain together very well, to the point where his attacks feel very fair and reasonable to dodge, even if sometimes they might be challenging. The attacks from the Flame Lurker would go on to become staples for beast enemies throughout the rest of the Souls games, such as the swipes, smashes, and leaps, which all chain together very well in this fight as I mentioned earlier, and it makes the fight keep you on your toes throughout all of it. And even though I don't find it nearly as difficult as everyone else says, I still enjoy this fight and it's one that I look forward to. Well, I guess there's no putting it off any longer. It's time to talk about the Dragon God. I hate everything about this fight. This is genuinely my least favorite boss in the entire Souls series. And yes, I did just say that unironically. This fight is so bad that I hate it more than the fucking Bed of Chaos itself. This fight's gimmick is that you have to hide behind pillars whenever the boss is looking at you, and whenever it looks away, you have to run to the next one, possibly destroy some rubble in the process, until you manage to reach 2 ballistas, which will immobilize the boss. This gimmick is already pretty lame on its own, and combine that with the fact that the game does not tell you at all, or even hint to you how you're supposed to get past this boss, and you have a recipe for disaster already. Sometimes the pillars work well with this fight, sometimes they do their actual job, and sometimes the Dragon God just decides to fist you to death anyway because the pillars are too fucking small. Also, with his fire breath in the second part of the fight, you'd think that hiding behind the pillars would let you avoid the fire breath, but I guess the developers hate you and still want you to get one-shotted anyway, so they made the fire go through the pillars. How does that make sense? Combined with this, Dragon God has a lot of RNG involved, which kind of determines how difficult or easy the fight's gonna be, and it also determines whether or not he's gonna follow the rules or fist you to death or burn you alive just because. This is already bad, but there's one aspect of it that makes it far worse than the Bed of Chaos for me. You see, those two fights, they have something in common, and that's the whole getting to 2 things and then killing the boss gimmick. But the difference with the Bed of Chaos is that at least it saves the progress you made when you die. So if you activate one of those things, you only have the other one left to go once you die. However, with Dragon God, if you get killed at any point, you have to start from the fucking beginning. I've already showcased why I think this boss is the worst in the series. From bullshit to unfun game mechanics, a lame gimmick, and the fact that they gave this fight to something named Dragon God, and something that looks this awesome no less. I've already shown that I hate this fight more than any other in the series, but wait till you see how this goddamn piece of shit ends. So you mean to tell me, after I suffered so much, after I put up with so much bullshit, this is what I get as my reward? This? A little section where you tickle his chin for a little bit while he's barely able to fight back? This is just the most anticlimactic way you could possibly end a boss fight. It just felt like a complete slap in the face after I had to suffer through so much of this fight. This boss is the biggest piece of filth that Hidetaka Miyazaki has ever created. Fuck everything about this boss. It is every single bad element for a fight possible that synchronizes horribly into the worst boss fight, not only in Demon Souls, but the entire Souls series. Fuck this boss. The next boss is the Leechmonger, and it's also really bad. Granted, I don't think it's anywhere near as awful as Dragon God is, but it's still a bad fight regardless. Once you've finished with your leisurely little stroll down to the boss, you'll find that its moveset is nothing exciting. However, there's one thing with this fight that makes it very annoying in the early game, and that is its healing, because it can heal a good chunk of health very quickly. Combining the healing with the fact that you'll be doing less damage earlier on, and the fact that all it does is just sit there and flail around, and you'll have a pretty horrible experience in the early game. Whereas in the late game, this thing becomes a complete joke, which honestly, I'm not really upset about, because I do not like this fight. It is awful. The Fool's Idol is where I'm able to start talking about the better bosses in Demon Souls again, which I always appreciate because I really like this fight. Before I start talking about the actual fight though, I wanted to bring up this one unique thing about it that I haven't ever seen in any other Souls game since. If you run into the arena at first and then kill the Fool's Idol, you'll find that every single time you kill it, it'll just keep reviving. What you're meant to do is go outside the arena and find a particular NPC that keeps reviving it. Then you're supposed to kill that NPC so the Fool's Idol won't revive anymore. The way the fight works is that the Fool's Idol splits itself into many copies. Each copy has its own individual health bar, whereas the real Fool's Idol is the one with the boss health bar. They all individually shoot magical projectiles at you, and sometimes they'll place small pentagrams on the ground, which stun you completely if you touch them. I'm genuinely terrible at this boss, and I honestly consider it to be one of the hardest in the entire game. Even though I find this boss to be harder than most in Demon Souls, I do think it's a very fair boss, and as long as you're paying attention, you should be able to get past it. Overall, mistakes are costly, yet avoidable with this fight, and it was executed very well, and it's a fight that I always find myself looking forward to, even if I know I'm really bad at it. This boss is pretty good. I have a feeling this might be one of my most controversial opinions in this video, but I really like the Maneaters boss fight. The first part of this fight is against just one Maneater, which lets you learn its limited yet very deadly moveset for the rest of the fight, and its attacks are very well designed and thrilling to avoid. The moveset mostly consists of the Maneaters charging at you, trying to punch or smash you, and also possessing a magic attack which does damage. They're also able to fly above the pits in the arena and move places, meaning you're never quite safe in one place or another. Fighting a single Maneater is already unnerving for the reasons I just listed. However, after a certain amount of time has passed, a second Maneater will show up, most likely while the first one is still alive, leading to it becoming the first and only duo boss fight in the game. The moment where the second one shows up is genuinely very scary and tense for first-time players, and can often lead to the player making a mistake and getting killed. This boss for me is definitely one of the most tense and thrilling fights in the game. The Maneaters fight very well together, and it leads to a very enjoyable experience for me. However, it's not perfect, and there's one very infamous problem with it, and that is the AI of the Maneaters themselves is just really badly designed. I've most commonly witnessed them getting stuck in the geometry of the arena and throwing out attacks with absolutely no warning whatsoever. This leads to the fight often feeling unpolished, clunky, and overall having a very big amount of jank to it. Dark Souls 1 took this fight and improved it with the Bell Gargoyles, however, and it stands out to me as being one of the better ones from that game. And overall, even with the buggy AI, I still think the Maneaters is a really solid boss fight. I really like it. The old monk has a gimmick that is unlike any other boss in this game. You don't actually fight the old monk itself. Instead, the boss summons someone to fight you for him. If you're playing in offline mode, you'll get an NPC, which plays pretty standard for NPC battles in the series. And if you play online, you'll get another player, most likely. And if you get another player, the quality varies drastically with this boss fight, as it completely depends on who you get. I don't have a lot to say about this fight. I don't have any strong opinions on it, and it's by far the single hardest boss to review because of just how much the quality can vary depending on who you get in PvP. Okay, I kind of miss the old monk now because the Dirty Colossus is a boss fight that I really think is absolutely terrible. The Dirty Colossus only really has 3 moves in its moveset. The first is just the standard smash, and the second is it firing something out of its arm which coats you in bugs once it manages to hit you, which slowly depletes your health once it lands. And the third move is an AoE attack where it releases the bugs, and once again, the bugs will slowly deplete your health once they hit you. However, this is by no means a hard boss fight, as if you just circle strafe around it, you'll never die to it. The fight manages to both be very annoying and yet extremely easy both at the same time. I'm not a fan of this boss fight. The only one in this game that I think is worse is Dragon God, and really, that's not even a competition. But just because I think this fight is better than Dragon God, that doesn't mean I like it at all. In fact, this boss sucks. This is another hot take of mine in the video, I know, but I don't really like Maiden Astraya's boss fight all that much. Don't get me wrong, this fight has some truly fantastic lore behind it. Its musical score is one of the best in the game in both the original and the remake, and the end of the fight is a memorable heartbreaker. But when it comes to the actual gameplay, I'm just not really a fan of it. The way the fight plays out is that you fight Garl Vinland, the Knight of Maiden Astraya. However, you fight him in a very cramped space, which makes the fight play awkwardly and a little bit sloppily. They definitely could have expanded this pathway a little bit more, because man, playing it in this tiny space is just not very enjoyable for me. Aside from the dialogue you'll hear from Garl Vinland, there's nothing really special about this NPC encounter, and the fact that that's all the fight really is a little bit disappointing. This boss is really great in terms of the lore, but in terms of gameplay, I will say I do think the fight is a little bad. The Penetrator marks a significant step up in quality for the last part of Demon Souls when it comes to the bosses. This fight may not seem like anything special at first glance, however, the thing that I love is that it's a very well done duel between two knights. This boss is also one of the more challenging in the game for me. One of the reasons why is that sometimes with Demon Souls, I tend to get a little bit too reliant on shields. I feel like the Penetrator might have been specifically designed to punish shield-reliant players, as his attacks can bash through high-level stamina bars easily. But if you focus mainly on the dodges, you'll be in for one of the best bosses in this game. Most of the Penetrator's attacks are the horizontal and diagonal swings that you might expect from a knight of this type. However, he also has a protracted thrusting move, which can sometimes catch me off guard if I'm not careful. This was one of only a few bosses in the game that I really struggled with on my first playthrough, and to this day I still get anxious and tense whenever I fight this boss. However, it's difficult for all the right reasons, and this increase in difficulty is warranted and, to be honest, kind of welcome, considering the fact that most of Demon Souls' bosses are pretty easy compared to the rest of the series. This boss is the kind of straightforward duel between two warriors that I'd been craving throughout the entirety of the game up to this point, and it's a fight that I look forward to a lot throughout repeated playthroughs. And not only that, but it's one of the best fights this game has to offer. There's only one boss that I think actually tops this, and overall, this boss is challenging, but extremely well balanced and fair. I love it. Well, we're now at the very end of the game, here to fight the Old King Allant, the best boss in all of Demon Souls. Just like the Penetrator, this boss does not have any gimmick attached to it whatsoever, and it is instead a duel between two warriors. No gimmicks or anything like that, just two swords clashing, and man, what a hell of a fight it is. Adding on to this, the Old King Allant has the best moveset of any boss in the game. His attacks are regular attacks with his sword, charging and then attacking, leaping into the air and then coming back down onto you, swinging his sword at you, and an AoE attack where he plunges his sword into the ground. However, there's a twist to a lot of his sword swings, as he's also able to do a particular move where he fires a blast of air out of his sword at you, meaning that no matter what distance you're at, you have to be able to dodge this boss well. This boss is not only a step up in quality, however, as it's also a step up in difficulty, as it's easily the hardest fight in Demon Souls for me. However, the difficulty is very well executed, and overall, it's a very well done test of patience and dodge timing above all else. I remember on my first playthrough where it took me hours just to take this guy down, and I've gotta say, after learning his moveset, this boss really is a treat. And even after having beaten the Dark Souls trilogy, Bloodborne, and Elden Ring, this boss still made me feel extremely tense and excited when I was about to beat it. And as the fight goes on longer, it becomes more and more tense as it becomes more clear how costly a mistake can be. If I had to pick anything at all to complain about really, it would just be this one minor thing. And that's this grab attack he has where he can actually de-level your character if you fail to avoid the attack, which is frankly pretty cheap. But besides that one very minor complaint I have, I think this boss is absolutely fantastic. It's easily the best in all of Demon Souls, and it holds up even when compared to a lot of bosses that came after it. Fantastic. Best boss in the game. The final boss of the game is less than fantastic. In fact, the true King Allant is probably one of the worst bosses in the game. This boss is complete trash, because he doesn't even really try to attack you that much, and the few attacks he does have are so pitifully easy to avoid that he might as well not try at all. And look, I get it, they're trying to show that the true King Allant is a complete shadow of his former self, but there are just better ways to show this. Take for example, Gwyn from Dark Souls 1. He was clearly fallen and a complete shadow of what he once was, but they didn't sacrifice gameplay for story. He could still fight, it was just clear that his fighting had regressed a lot. True King Allant really is a bad boss, but I will admit, I am a fan of its lore, and the atmosphere it does provide is pretty well made. But overall, this is an extreme disappointment of a final boss, and definitely the worst final boss From Software has ever made. So, in conclusion, I think that Demon Souls has probably the weakest boss lineup out of any game in the series. However, I don't think it has an overall bad boss lineup. Yes, its boss lineup may be a mixed bag. However, for every truly horrific boss fight, we have bosses like the Penetrator or Old King Allant. This game is a masterpiece, just like all the other Souls games, and I'm so happy to finally have this video out. I really enjoyed making it, and I love being able to talk about these games on YouTube. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time.